Today we have two consecutive panels with a break in between, and after lunch we will have our third and the closing keynote of the day. And then we will see how we will wrap this up. And I'm very happy today also to welcome my colleague Elizabeth Saleh, who will be the discussant on this panel. The panel is titled Framing Ecologies Around Water, Weather, Self. Elizabeth is an assistant professor in sociocultural anthropology in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Media Studies at the American University of Beirut. She works at the intersection of political and economic anthropology. Her first long-term ethnographic fieldwork was based in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley and culminated in 2014 in her doctoral thesis about the Lebanese wine industry. Elizabeth's current ethnographic research began in 2015 and is about the lives of underage Syrian waste pickers growing up at a small scrapyard located in a rundown building in Beirut. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Hi, everyone. It's really wonderful to be here, and thank you, Ahmed, for inviting me to chair and be a discussant of this panel. I'll try not to break any equipment while I'm up here, which is something I tend to do, not on purpose, of course, unless I'm being filmed, so not on purpose ever at all. I'm kidding. I'm very happy to introduce the three speakers on this panel, Framing Ecologies Around Water, Weather, and Self, or Self. The first speaker, Joelle Deeb, is her presentation is entitled Cartographies of Water Commons, Fluid Ecologies and Disrupted Landscapes. Joelle is an architect and researcher focusing on the intersection, who focuses on the intersection of water systems, urban development, and cultural heritage. In 2024, she founded and now leads the Water Commons Archives-Syria, a research initiative dedicated to documenting Syria's bordering systems and supporting urban studies and educational outreach. Her work sheds light on the evolving spatial dynamics of water systems and their deep impact on the socio-cultural fabric of the Middle East. Since 2023, Joelle has spearheaded the development of the Orontes River Repository, an archive that explores the socio-environmental challenges facing the Orontes River Basin through innovative cartographic mapping and experimental documentation. Her research uncovers the erosion of collective memory and reimagines spatial practices as acts of cultural reflection and continuity. Her work has been selected for the Venice Biennale, I always say that incorrectly, so hopefully I said it correctly today, Architettura 2025, and honored with the prestigious Biennale College Architettura grant. Her work has been featured on several influential platforms and writings, including Afikra, Daftar Journal, MIT Thresholds 50, and her research on water knowledge earned her the 2023 International Tamayuz Excellence Award for her thesis and the 2024 Ittijahat Research Grant. Through her work, she remains dedicated to bridging community-driven research, documentation, and design. Our next speaker, Sophie, who is work is alongside Sasha Engelman, and Sophie is here today with us. Very happy for that. And the title of her talk is the year. Again, I kicked that. Sorry. The Year of the Weather. Open Weather is a feminist experiment in imaging the Earth and its weather systems using DIY tools. We weave, so Sophie and Sasha together weave speculative storytelling with low-cost hardware and open source software to transform our relations to a planet in a climate crisis. Co-led by designer Sophie Dyer and geographer Sasha Engelman since 2020, Open Weather makes artworks, leads inclusive workshops, and develops resources on satellite imagery, reception, and reading. Our final speaker today, Imani Jacqueline Brown, also very excited to have you here today. Her work, her paper, her presentation is entitled Fractal Catastrophes Generate New Solidarities. Imani is an artist, activist, and architectural researcher from New Orleans, based in London. Her work investigates the continuum of extractivism, which spans from settler colonial genocide and slavery to fossil fuel production and climate change. In exposing the layers of violence and resistance that forms the foundations of settler colonial society, she opens up space to imagine paths to ecological reparations. Imani's practice combines photography, videography, archival research, ecological philosophy, legal theory, people's history, remote and local sensing, and counter-cartographic strategies to disentangle the spatial logics that make geographies, unmake communities, and breaks Earth's geology. Her research is disseminated internationally through art installations, public actions, reports, and testimony delivered to courts and organs of the United Nations. Among other things, Imani is a PhD candidate in geography at Queen Mary, University of London, a research fellow with forensic architecture, and a member of the RISE St. James, Louisiana Historic Community. Everyone, I'm very happy to invite the speakers. Do they all come to the, or one by one? One by one. So I'm very happy to welcome the speakers today, and I would like to invite Joelle to come to the panel there, or here.
Hello. My name is Joelle Deeb. First of all, I would like to thank Elizabeth for the wonderful introduction. I'm truly excited to be part of City Debates this year. I want to thank Beirut Urban Lab for opening their space to think through the urgencies of our region. Today, we're going to talk about, I'll be speaking a bit about water commons, especially in contexts where ecologies are not only disrupted by climate crisis or infrastructural decay, but also shaped by conflict, colonial impact, and the erasure of local knowledge that surrounds it. Through my work on the Water Commons Archives-Syria, I've been trying to trace layered relationships between water and territories, especially how shared river basins have been shaped and reshaped by cartographic practices, shifting political borders, and the everyday survival strategies of the communities that live along their banks. But to also think about these present entanglements, we need to take a look a little bit into the past, at how rivers were once mapped, categorized, territorialized, because these early cartographic practices and decisions, often made in service of authority, still ripple through our current ecological and political realities. So, one of the clearest moments for me personally in my work, where I found water, power, and mapping practices colliding, was during the French mandate on Syria and Lebanon. So as you know, after dividing the region into spheres of influence, the French mandate officially began in 1920s. This marked the moment when France acquired control over Syria and Lebanon, both regions of immense strategic importance. So with the French mandate sanctioned by the League of Nations, the French didn't simply assert political control, they sought to produce detailed knowledge about the land. And one of their most powerful tools in this process was their mapping acts and practices. So with the new mandate, back then, of course, came an urgent need for a comprehensive understanding of these territories, these newfound territories that they acquired. The French quickly realized that to govern effectively, they needed more than military presence or legal frameworks. They needed to make the land more readable for their sense. This legibility and the readability of these landscapes took shape with the creation of the Typographic Bureau of the French Army of the East, which was stationed in Beirut and Damascus from the early 1920s, composed of military engineers, surveyors, archaeologists, and geographers. The Bureau's mission was quite clear. Established around 1922, The Bureau played a key role in producing strategic maps of the newly delineated territories. These maps served various purposes, from military strategy to urban planning, to surveying national boundaries and documenting natural resources, all of which influenced the region's long-term political landscapes. Mapping quickly became an essential tool for governance, helping the French assert their authorities and define territorial boundaries. Now, the Bureau understood the significance of rivers in specific as a symbol of control, and the strategic placement of borders either followed the path of rivers, complementing how the flow of them, or created divisions that disrupted existing communities and land uses, their waters becoming a part of a negotiation process for access and control. Now, as you see, this is a map that was created in 1924 of Deir ez-Zor, which is on the Euphrates. And you can actually see how close up the mapping of the river is in regards to the urban formation of Deir ez-Zor. In the years following the establishment of the Bureau, the French cartographers began producing a series of maps that detailed the boundaries and landscapes of their mandate. Among these were a particularly significant set of 12 maps created in 1924. We saw one earlier, but I've brought 6 maps with me today to sort of take a look at how borders were quite important then. So it focused on, let's say, the Gulf of Iskandarun, which is basically close to the Orontes, borders between Syria and Lebanon, Deir ez-Zor, Homs, borders between Turkey and Syria, and so on and so forth. Each map in the series was drawn, reflecting the complex topography of Syria and Lebanon, and illustrating how the rivers and borders interacted with land. These maps were part of a huger effort to assert French authorities over the newly defined territories. They became reference points for understanding the relationship between different regions, distribution of population, and the movement of resources. Many maps made by the Bureau became templates for later national Syrian and Lebanese cartography. However, they reflected, a colonial logic, dividing land according to the French priorities, often overlooking indigenous land practices and local environmental knowledge. Now, as we see, this is also the Euphrates. There was such a close focus on the Euphrates during these maps. And it shows, through a very simplified sense, the formations that were among it. Now, what I want to bring across with all this is that many academics, such as Jacques Walros, heavily relied on the maps and geographical data produced by the Bureau in their fieldwork. Publications that occurred, in particular, were instrumental in interpreting the landscapes that the Bureau had meticulously mapped, providing cultural, ethnic, and historical context of these geographical surveys. And many statements came after that, and one of them that I sort of chose for this, when I saw it, it was quite interesting. And I'm going to read it very quickly. This is the way I see the nature of the rural hydraulic realms in the Levant. No overall plan, no collective effort, no overriding rational conception. Irrigation remains the domain of the individual or of a limited collectivity, perfect at a village level, but unable to reach beyond this narrow context. Now, this is an intensely cited person speaking about the region and the landscapes of our hometowns. So, as the French consolidated control over Syria and Lebanon, and the British, of course, over Palestine and parts of Iraq, tension inevitably arose over how these newly created states would relate to one another, particularly when it comes to defining their boundaries. Of course, in the 1920, the Franco-British Convention set the stage that would come the Pauline-Newcomb Commission. and it was registered at the League of Nations Treaty Series in 1924, giving grant the terms international legal recognition, which gave further legitimacy to the colonial imposition of borders for years to come. As I spoke earlier, it became, these maps and agreements shaped how we think of our geopolitics, defining the territorial scope of the French and British mandates in the Middle East as before and as well as currently, because, like, as you know. Now, what I wanted to focus on with this agreement is a few sort of language that was used with the main convention statement. And I'm going to read a few to see how they viewed our lands when they were sort of dividing it. I'm going to go through just a bit, just saying, so entire basins of the western Khabur and passing in a straight line towards the Euphrates, which was a line on its own under the French territory under the French mandate, the Yarmouk in territory under the French mandate, valley of the Yarmouk of the railway, which was constructed after the agreement, was situated under the British mandate. From that point, it will reach the track on from Al Qunaitira to Banias at the point marked. So what I wanted to say here is that they defined our region in regards to the rivers and water resources that we currently have and we're seeing at the time being. Fast forward, okay, I'm going to be very quick with the historical thing, but fast forward to 1946, the French mandate in Syria officially ended. Congratulations, Syria. And Syria gained its independence. However, the maps that were drawn during that time period, along with its imposed boundaries, remained in circulation, influencing the nation's territorial decisions. So post-independence, governments inherited this colonial mindset surrounding land and water management, often contesting and negotiating these inherent legacies as they sought to define Syria's new national identity. It was moments like these where knowledge systems, including maps, cartographies, and many others, were altered. Now, Joelle, thank you for the historical lesson at 8 a.m., but why is this important in our region? Well, when we study like the French maps in specific in the Middle East and the region of Syria and Lebanon and the Yarmouk sort of situation in the south, we quickly realized that shaping our boundaries was not just a political or military act, it was an ecological one. Because from between the 1920 and the 1923, the Commission set extensive hikes through the anti-Lebanon mountains, tracing the Orontes or Al-Asi as we know it. River, in particular, which emerged as a significant marker. They marked 71 geographical dents through the Orontes, and I've been looking for this map for a long time. I haven't found it yet, but it's they marked the land in regards to geographical context on the Orontes River during that time period, and that sort of shows that it was more of a geographical influence and colonization. So maps at that time period was tools to be allocated, controlled, exploited. They ignored the profound connections between people and their environments, reducing landscapes to mere boundaries. By contrast, local knowledge systems often passed down over generations view water, land, and ecosystems as integral parts of the urban and cultural life. These knowledge systems understand the importance of balance when we look into the local community and the sustainability of our shared water resources. Now, this is where our role becomes very crucial. As environmentalists, urbanists, architects, builders, scholars, and so on, it requires us to look at the land and its resources through shared knowledge and collective responsibility. Because let's be honest, rivers don't recognize political boundaries. Neither does the knowledge of those who lived alongside them for generations. Therefore, claiming shared ecologies is both a political and urban process, a process that involves unlearning colonial boundaries and rediscovering a more intricate, ecological grounded relationship with the natural world. This reclaiming process is a way of acknowledging the deep, often invisible ties between people and the lands they inhabit. We're going to look at this from 3 different perspectives, and they're all connected to water, obviously. We're going to look into water, or in water, practices of collection, immersion and everyday infrastructure of survival, around water, so habitation, movement, and the built environment, and against water, which is my favorite part, intrusions, ruptures, and contested claims. We're going to start off by looking at practice of collection, and looking at how water collection methods emerged around rivers. As you can see, okay, so the right, on your right, no wait, on your left, you can see a photo taken by Harold Lamb in 1933 of the Norias on the Orontes River. There were 175 water lifting structures on the Orontes. Currently, there are only 10 functional, and the rest are quite erased. On the third picture, which is also a water lifting structure that's sort of is on the Quwaiq, which is a river connecting Aleppo on the boundaries of Turkey. And in the middle, you can see the Euphrates, which took on a more traditional water collection practice along the Euphrates. Of course, they also had water lifting structures, but I wanted to show that most of it was carried on as a sort of thing. So yeah, Al-Asi, Al-Furat, Al-Quwaiq, just so we can... So looking at this, these water collection methods, I think it's quite important to sort of take the local community into account when we're, this is mostly done by interviews, done by communal work. You go to the community, you ask around, you figure out how things work for them. That's how the simplest form it can be put. As you can see, the first one is part of the water lifting structures on Al-Asi, which is in Al-Rastan. Now currently it's been disputed about water structures being for Hama only, but no, Al-Rastan also had a lot of water structures and typologies for it. In the middle, it's Al-Khabur River, which is a tributary to the Euphrates. And the water collection, the third one, is for the Al-Quwaiq, and you can see that it's a bit less in terms of points. As we know, we don't quite know much about Al-Quwaiq right now in terms of history. It hasn't been documented very well. And it's decaying very badly. So we have to sort of do what we can to sort of sustain what knowledge we have on that. Now I'm going to be quick now, right? I need to do, okay. So around water, more about habitation, movement, and the built environment, which is my background in architecture sort of situation. We're looking at how people inhabited the riverbanks vernacularly, and later on I'll get more into non-vernacular structures. We see how deep-rooted relationship between land and water. These spaces were shaped by local knowledge and practices, where communities adapted and responded to their environments in ways that reflected their cultural and ecological understanding. We see reed architecture in Al-Ghab region, which is on the Orontes. We see mud houses in the Euphrates, and we see the structures that were built on the Quwaiq or what's left of them. Now, I really love talking about vernacular architecture, but I'm going to focus today on a different project that I thought it was quite interesting to shed light on, which is the housing project that emerged in the aftermath of the collapse of the Zayzoun Dam in 2002. A mere 6 years after its construction marks one of the most devastating episodes in this history of rural Hama. The dam, initially built in 1996 during the reign of the Syrian regime, unleashed a torrent of Al-Asi floodwaters, completely wiping out the Zayzoun village and leaving several villages on its side, as you can see. I don't know, can you see it? Okay. Leaving several villages like Al-Mashbak, Tal Wasit, and Al-Ziyara in ruins. The damage was widespread, more than 10,000 individuals were displaced, 251 homes were completely destroyed, and another 130 were left partly damaged. So in the momentous aftermath of this disaster, the government at the time sought to address the displacement crisis quite quickly. So in 2003, a year after the fall, the collapse, a response emerged, while swift, carried marks of a bit ill-considered way of housing projects after crises. A bit of a hasty solution, but the Zayzoun model village was born, constructed on 35.5 hectares of agricultural land. Now, as we know from the Beqa Valley, this is on the Orontes River, so we know it's based, agriculturally based region. People rely on agriculture for their day-to-day life. So it was funded by external money and intended to house displaced farmers. The intention behind the project was straightforward: to provide shelter and relief to those whose homes and livelihoods has been destroyed. However, the village stood as an example how rapid top-down construction can miss the mark when it disregards the local context. Now, this is all around the river basin, that's why it's part of my work. But the village composed of 504 identical prefabricated housing units, which was designed to provide basic shelter and failed to accommodate practices of the people it sought to help, which are farmers, right? A stark contradiction, a transition that was both impractical for the people and their practices. I really need to, okay. Impractical and disorienting for farmers that were tied to agriculture. It didn't give them the required space, and it was often overlooked it didn't provide the space for them to continue on with their practices. Now, against water, this is my favorite part, so we need to address that. We're talking about intrusions right now. So, in December 2024, following the collapse of the Assad regime, Israeli occupation forces withdrew from the 1974 disengagement agreement, further escalating water tensions in Syria. Now, the Israeli occupation occupied the peak of Jebel al-Sheikh, as previously it also did parts of the mountain, especially the Jolan Heights, which has intensified disputes over water rights. As we know, Jebel al-Sheikh is a repository for water access in Syria. We take most of our water resources from it. That occurred on the Yarmouk in January 2025 with the seizure of Al-Mantara Dam, southern Syria's second largest dam and a vital source for the Yarmouk River Basin, which is a tributary to the Jordan River connecting Syria, Palestine, and Jordan. On January 2nd, 2025, Israeli forces seized the dam in Al-Samdaniya Al-Gharbiya, converting it into a military base, and according to local resources, and this is only local resources, restrictions were imposed on local residents' movement for a while, further destabilizing the region. So Al-Mantara Dam was crucial for irrigating the farmlands of Quneitra Governorate, making it its control and imposed geographical move. This expansion positions Israeli with 60% of the Yarmouk water river. They have 60% of our water taken since January 2025. So it took the Jebel al-Sheikh, Sayda Jolan, key villages in western Daraa and Quneitra. So what I did was I tried to map from the local resources that we have, because it's quite concealed, a few of the villages that are currently under this sort of situation. Now, Joelle, you're also doing a sort of mapping. How is it different than what we were talking about previously? And I would like to say, well, French maps were sort of static and extractive. Just look at it. I'm almost done. They viewed rivers as mere lines, plots of property, lands of a commodity to be controlled. State-controlled institutions operated top-down, relying on standardized data, often produced under guidance of imperial powers like the Bureau. The primary focus was on borders, with maps crafted to define territorial lines, enforce controlled resources, and manage populations. In this system, vernacular knowledge in these maps were erased. Local hydrological practices and indigenous water knowledge was dismissed and simplified, losing their cultural context. And I want to point out that these were secretive at that time in nature, produced for administrative control and power rather than shared understanding and collaboration, whilst what I'm trying to do is accomplish quite the opposite. I'm trying to make this sort of representation as relational and living, a community-governed practice, not led by institutions of power, but rather by field workers, by artisans, by farmers, those most intimately connected with the land. It disregards the borders completely. I'm just putting that out there, with a primary lens, which to understand the region as centers of waters, lands, and people, and with heavily emphasis on local knowledge. It's open source and accessible for anyone to use, to share what they have to contribute and put input on what we can do sort of better, what knowledge do they have from their families, and bringing the archive to the people rather than to the institution. I'm just going to show you part of the conversations that occurred and the sketches that were done. So it goes from on-site conversations to preliminary framework, data structuring. Okay. Well, I was almost done. It's the repositories. Okay. Well, I'm just going to leave you off with this map, which is the basins without the borders of our region. And I think it's quite important to take a look at this from a water perspective rather than that. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joelle. That was, it was a performance of resistance on many levels. I will try and keep to 20 minutes. Huge thank you first to Elizabeth for the very generous introductions, Ahmed for inviting us. I say us because Open Weather is a collaborative project, which will become clear. Antonia, thank you so much for all of the coordination and in general the Beirut Urban Lab for the last 1.5 days. So my name is Sophie, and I'm a designer, and I've actually spent the last 7 years working in or adjacent to human rights and journalism. But the project that I'm going to present today is on a bit of a different register, and it's very much a personal project. So my presentation, I'm going to say we throughout, because it's a project that was developed by, maybe I just need to have here, developed with Sasha Engelman, who is my collaborator and interlocutor. And Sasha is a prolific writer, geographer, an educator, and Sasha works in London at Royal Holloway at the Centre for Geohumanities. Okay, so sadly Sasha is not here with us today. And that reason is really actually linked into the project, because in January, alongside other residents of LA, Sasha watched as her community in the Palisades burned down in a wildfire. So Sasha's currently taking some time off just to kind of look after herself and her family, so I'm kind of representing for the two of us. In this meteorological event, there was also a media event and, of course, a profoundly political event. It's really become entangled in our collaborative practice, and it's really kind of testing the questions that we're asking and the ways that we're working in our practice that is really about the more than meteorological weathers of the climate crisis. So Sasha and I began writing speculative fiction together in 2017, around the time of the pandemic. And at the same time, we got our amateur radio licenses. And this was a moment in which our fiction really kind of became a hands-on practice. And this is a theme that kind of persists in the project today. So my radio call sign is M6NYX, and Sasha is M6IOR. And these call signs are important because it means we have permission to transmit and receive radio waves. And Nyx is actually the Greek goddess of the night, just in case you know that reference. So to obtain these call signs, Sasha and I sweated it out in a scout hut in the suburbs of London, and we were often the only kind of woman-coded people in the room, learning usually expensive methods to transmit and receive radio that often require copious leisure time, access to resources, and also ideally a house or a car to mount an antenna, none of which we had at the time. So we really co-founded the project Open Weather in response to this, as well as, and I think it's really important to say, our different professional experiences of working on mapping, open source, and remote sensing projects that, in my experience, like too often reproduce the very asymmetries of power that they seek to challenge. You're seeing here illustrations by Golrock and Alfizia, visual artists who we're collaborating with. That's part of the fictional dimension of the project that's existing in the background, but I'm not speaking about. So we're far from alone. Or I say, actually, I'll just quickly say that, as you said, Elizabeth, we often describe Open Weather as a feminist experiment in imaging, and so reimagining the Earth using low-cost hardware and open source software. But Open Weather has always been an experiment in how we organize, how we skill share, and how we transmit good knowledge, and how we attribute and how we administrate. So we're really far from alone in privileging how the work gets done. So two early influences for us are the work of Catherine Donazzi and Laura Klein, who we heard yesterday talking about data feminism. Also here, the work of the Clear Action Research Lab in Newfoundland, Canada, run by Max Liborion, and their lab handbook, which is available online. So guided by these questions of power, access, and positionality, we've been developing DIY resources for satellite image or satellite signal reception and decoding. We also run public workshops and make artworks. So far, Open Weather has held 28 DIY satellite ground station workshops in 9 countries, both remotely and in person. And here's a kind of like a whistle-stop tour of those workshops. So with members of the public in Amsterdam and in Athens, with children and young people in the UK, with educators remotely in Ukraine and in the US, and most recently in a gallery in Leipzig in Germany during the once-in-a-century storm Boris. So as a result of these workshops and the circulation of our online digital tools, today Open Weather is both a highly interdisciplinary cultural project and a network of more than 120 artists, educators, and young people unevenly spread around the world. In our workshops, you can see here, participants learn how to use low-cost hardware and software to receive the transmissions of 3 orbiting weather satellites. The satellites are NOAA 15, NOAA 18, and NOAA 19. They're really special for many reasons that we can go into in the discussion afterwards. But perhaps most importantly, their 137 megahertz downlink transmission is genuinely public access. And they're transmitting real-time weather images. So the participants receive these transmissions and record them as an audio file, and they then learn how to decode them into an image. So we don't explicitly promote our workshops for groups that have been excluded and underrepresented in histories of amateur radio and remote sensing, but we do insist that the institutions that we work with remove or lower barriers to access by provision of equipment and no or low fees. And we do ourselves we do the best we can ourselves to develop a curriculum that is that assumes no prior knowledge of radio and is responsive to who is in the room and the concerns and interests that they bring. So my talk is a dispatch from our current project that's called Year of Weather. And I think I've said to Ahmed like the year of weather, but it's also a year of weather. As you'll see, it's very plural. It's also quite like a raw reflection in a way. So this is the first time I do this kind of, this cut of the project. On the questions that we're asking that have, if not changed since we first presented the project a year ago at Columbia when I met Mona from the lab, but the questions have certainly multiplied. And one reason is from the outset, Sasha and I conceived this project as answering a question that we often get at the end of workshops, which is also where currently our resources stop, which is how do we read the images we collect, and by extension, how do we read the weather? Or to reverse that question, how is weather and climate written into the images, and so the Open Weather Public Archive? So you'll see how that question has not yet been answered. So the Year of Weather very much builds on previous collective Earth imaging events that we've been doing since 2020. Here you see one of our nowcasts. So in 2020, in response to the circulation of our first how-to guide, Sasha and I began to speculate, does a latent network of DIY satellite ground stations exist? So to ask that question and also to kind of activate the network, we invited everybody that we knew who had replicated our how-to guide so far, around 30 people at the time, to receive a satellite image on the same day and send us the audio file. So the outcome is what you see here, which is this kind of incomplete planetary nowcast of Earth's weather. And it really kind of, at the same time, evidenced the existence of this network, albeit fragile and uneven. And there's a quote from New York-based artist Ingrid Barrington that perhaps best describes maybe the most familiar satellite image to many of us, that is Google Earth. And Ingrid Barrington describes it as forever noon on a cloudless day, in reference to its composite base map that is stripped of cloud, always sunlit, and never in shadow. And you can see here by contrast, our image is always partial, it's noisy, and it's profoundly weathered. So now you see our second nowcast. So in 2022, on the first day of the COP26 climate conference that was happening in Glasgow, Scotland, which is geographically close to where we both lived at the time, we asked a different question. We asked, how can this growing network of DIY satellite, or what can this growing network of DIY satellite ground stations sense and record? So this time we asked contributors to annotate their images with a description of the weather as they experienced it, and if or where they located the climate crisis in their local communities or environment. So on the 31st of October 2021, the first day of COP, 40 images from 29 ground stations were submitted to the Open Weather Public Archive, from Scotland to Japan to Kinshasa in the Congo, and Newcastle in Australia. And with our long-time collaborators in design and code that also work together with a team of us at Forensic Architecture, Lizzie, Malcolm and Dan Powers at the Scottish design studio Rectangle, we batched, processed and mapped these individual kind of snapshots onto an equal Earth projection. And you can see here that the resulting nowcast is this kind of jagged array of images and weather notes interspersed with large empty spaces where no member of the network was present. So Emergency Department Doctor Zach Vetstein, you see his image here from captured in Seattle on the Pacific West Coast, wrote, "I see the impacts of climate change reverberating in my community and environment." In the first nowcast in 2020, Zach could quite literally see in his image the wildfire smoke that he was treating in the lungs of his patients. So Zach is kind of describing an event unfolding at multiple scales at once. In Argentina, cartographer and marine technician Joaquin Azura and journalist Amy Jujas describe experiencing unexpected low temperatures after the arrival of the cold Sudestada wind and the hottest October. So in their weather note, they describe the specific land relations of local indigenous communities, reminding us that weather is more than our immediate conditions or an object of measurement. It is histories, it is life worlds and relations too. And lastly, in Kinshasa in the DRC, Cedric Chimbalanga, whose image you see here, noted how the sun dominates a lengthening dry season. So paying attention to Zach, Cedric, and Joaquin, and Amy's and other contributors' material, Sasha and I began to read the nowcast as a fractal composition. And this is why I was so excited partly to be on a panel with Imani. So unlike a theory of multiple perspectives, fractals really help us to hold on to how each contributor has a different ontological position in relation to the Earth and climate crisis. So a fractal Earth is one that is of multiple differently unfolding worlds and relations, as well as the interconnections and solidarities that bind local struggles. This is an interactive website that I would normally be navigating, but I'm going with the lo-fi PDF today. So the Year of Weather. The Year of Weather really builds on these previous nowcasts, but it also breaks from them in important ways. And I'm going to try and tell you how in the next 5 minutes. So the project is unfolding over 12 months. When the average global temperature, as you know, has exceeded 1.5 degrees for the first time. And meanwhile, in the US, public ownership and access to environmental knowledge is threatened by attempts to dismantle NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, that is the satellite's namesake. And this institution has problematic history and is absolutely a colonial institution. At the same time, it's also transmitted open access satellite images internationally since the 1970s. So in this political climate this year, there is also the end of the contract to maintain the 3 satellites that we work with, bringing to the end, potentially the end of an era of truly public access weather images. So in the year of weather, we're responding to these conditions as well as our own questions, and we're building together with the Open Weather Network a living collective and really kind of thickening map of planetary weather. And I'll briefly say how this framing has kind of shifted from as we do the work in the project. Thinking a little bit with Catherine Donazio, who said who has this phrase of kind of what happens when we move from speculative ethics to real world relations. So this next final section is a little bit about reframings and shifts in time and attention. So the question is kind of what happened next in the project. And the answer is really infrastructure. So I'm going to briefly show you 3 kind of infrastructural interventions that we've made. The first is our browser-based satellite decoder here. We maintain the only browser-based satellite decoder for these 3 satellites. And the reason why we built it is because the proprietary software that exists is a big barrier to access to people receiving and decoding the images. It is also incredibly black box, and it often can't be easily installed on the laptops of the people that we work with, especially, for example, school children and students. So we also migrated our public archive from Google Sheets to our own green servers, at the same time making it the materials more visible, navigable, and downloadable. And we've added a data MOU. I'm skipping bits here, but we can go into geeky code in the panel if we have time. We had to write some of the maths longhand because the coding libraries don't exist, at least with web-based languages, for what we wanted to do. So there's a whole other story there. And here you see the public archive again. And thirdly, we recognize that manually capturing satellite images using the handheld antennas, while still core to the Open Weather project, it's really time intensive and labor intensive, and we have a limited funding situation. So to widen access and build the archive of daily images that we needed for the Year of Weather project, we've been working to develop our own Raspberry Pi and 3D printed and of course open source satellite ground stations. So there you see Sasha, my collaborator in London, assembling a ground station. It's essentially a radio receiver. It also calculates the orbits of the satellites, updates itself, turns on at the correct time and frequency, records the satellite, and then sends the recording to our archive. So these infrastructural interventions have really enabled us to open up the project and change who we can work with. But also, increasingly, we're getting contributions to the project from people who we have no contact with. So we're at this stage of kind of where it's there's a new level of unpredictability, but also openness. So to conclude, here are some images, I guess, of the kit that's been sent out. And yes, current hosts of our automatic ground stations include seaweed harvesters and a community farm in Cornwall, England. We have a student group from the MIT World Peace University in Pune, India, and a Chilean sound arts collective called Tsunami Arte Sonora in Valparaiso. And most recently, we added an amateur radio club working with schools in Nicosia in Cyprus, and this image will be familiar to many of you who are local to the region. So formally Open Weather began in 2024, but since then we've had hundreds of submissions to the project and to our archive. And I was going to read some of the submissions, but I will just show you instead some of the images. This was from a research vessel in the Southern Ocean. This is from a young person in Brazil who is building his own antenna, and an artist in London who regularly writes us quite beautiful weather notes. And this is, of course, from a few days ago. That just shows you kind of, I guess, like some of the complexities and urgencies of working on a project that, although being really a cultural project, is still kind of held to these changing external conditions and timelines, including potentially NOAA being disbanded, which will really, maybe bring forward the decommissioning of the satellites and really raises the stakes of asserting public access to environmental knowledge. So I'll just conclude by saying, and I'm going to quote and invoke Sasha here, all the way from London. So, there is a politics to building and maintaining infrastructure, to listening to systems at the threshold of transformation. In the long tradition of radio amateurs, cyber feminists, and anti-colonial practitioners, we feel that it is our responsibility to develop literacies with systems that capture and represent the planet, so that we are able to name them and the violence that they enact, as well as recognize their alternative meanings and potential openings for interventions or imagining otherwise. So by accounting for the unglamorous labor of building and maintaining infrastructure, you can see how the year of weather is really no longer a year. And also the questions we're asking have shifted towards stories of infrastructure, but also social relations. So how long is a year of weather really? Is it the 365 days of heat, storm, and rainfall that we imagined? Or is it the time it takes to dismantle the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration? Or is it, as Brazilian philosopher Denise Ferreira da Silva reminds us, 400 years of the racialized and capitalist expropriation of lands and goods, people and labor that has become the heat that we experience today that is driving the ever stranger and heavier weather? Thank you.